Over the course of this series, we've covered all sorts of unique and versatile sub-weapons, going into detail about all the small tricks and functionalities they have to offer and piecing those together to understand the strategies each utility sub enables and ultimately put a bit more respect on each of their names. Today though, the sub-weapon we're focusing on is one that's already widely perceived as powerful and has no need for me to defend it. If anything, it's been one of the most dominant tools available in the game's current state, being part of the kits of several popular weapons. For this final episode of the Utility Guide series, last but absolutely not least is the disadvantage-defying Splash Wall. Hello, I'm Pika, a high-level Splatoon coach and competitive player, and welcome back. There's no sub I'd rather end this series off with than Splash Wall, as this sub is simple yet incredibly powerful. The Splash Wall itself just exists wherever you place it, and the utility and creativity from it comes entirely from how you play around it. With that said, knowing the stats and mechanics of Splash Walls can help us understand the limits of what exactly we're working with. Before we get into that, I have a couple of disclaimers. First, note that this video is being made as a Splatoon 3 version 9.0, so if any balance changes are made to Splash Wall in the future that make any of the stats presented in this video outdated, I'll note those changes in the description and in the comments. It might sound crazy for me to say that now that regular content updates of this game are finished, but balance changes are confirmed to still be coming, given at a slower pace than before, and if any utility sub has a reason to receive changes at this point in the game, it would be Splash Wall, so who knows? Second, some of you may be feeling some deja vu, since another Splash Wall guide was put out here recently, that being from Dude, and I'm just gonna take a guess that if you're deep enough in Splatoon YouTube to find yourself here, that you probably also know about Dude. His video is very informative, and I'll be linking it in the description for you to check out after watching this one if you want even more knowledge on Splash Walls. I'll be making an effort to speed through the topics he spent a lot of time on in his guide and focus more on the details and tricks that he missed so that there's minimal overlap between our two videos. I know some people are bound to comment about that, but we've got to wrap this series up and the timing is a bit unfortunate, so I figure I might as well just acknowledge that now. Let's talk about Splash Walls themselves. Using a Splash Wall will cost you 60% of your ink tank, matching the cost of other utility subs like Toxic Mist and Ink Mines. Upon contact with the ground, they will lock in place and go through an activation startup time before the wall generates. When fully activated, Splash Wall creates a thin vertical barrier that blocks and absorbs damage from incoming enemy attacks and deflects enemies that make contact with it. Splash Walls have 800 health by default, enabling them to take some hard hits and still remain standing. Any enemies that make contact with the wall will be pushed away, effectively preventing them from moving through it, and they will take 30 damage. Meanwhile, none of these restrictions apply to the Splash Wall user or their teammates. You're free to fire and move through your team's Splash Walls as much as you please. This makes any engagements taken around your Splash Walls fundamentally one-sided. It is a core principle around what makes this sub so strong. Also, there can only be one Splash Wall on the stage at one time for each user. If you deploy another Splash Wall while one is already out, then the first one will immediately despawn. While Splash Walls have a pretty absurd amount of health to tank damage with, there are a couple things keeping them from staying on the stage forever. Most directly, Splash Walls will naturally lose 15% of their max health every second. This means that no Splash Wall can exist for longer than about 7 seconds, even if never attacked. And if enemies do deal partial damage to the wall but don't break it on their own, then the natural health decay will still finish it off for them before too much longer. This also means that if you do plan on taking a fight with your Splash Wall, then the sooner the better, as if you leave it out for a few seconds and then try to use it for cover, then a good chunk of its health will have already depleted, and it may break sooner than you'd hope it would once enemies start targeting it. In general, if you ever need a rough gauge of how much HP a Splash Wall has left, the ink tank on the wall itself displays the wall's percentage health remaining, with a full ink tank equating to full health and a near empty tank indicating that it's about to break. Second, in a lot of cases, Splash Walls are not as functionally tanky as their 800 HP value may lead you to believe, and this is due to damage multipliers. For every damageable object in the game, each source of damage can have their inflicted damage to the object be increased or decreased by set multipliers, and for Splash Wall, many of those happen to be quite generous. Many slower firing weapon classes have greatly buffed damage into Splash Walls, like Blaster and Splat Charger dealing double damage, Slosher dealing 2.5 times damage, and Splatana's dealing a whopping 4.8 times damage with their projectiles. Subs and specials also tend to have large damage multipliers against wall, like most bombs dealing double damage, and specials like Ultra Stamp being able to delete even a full health wall instantly with one swing. If walls are really giving you trouble, you can also equip Object Shredder to deal an increased 50% damage to them with any weapon or damage source. So while their overall health pool is huge, between the natural health decay and access to many potential ways to deal bonus damage to Splash Walls, they can be torn down quite quickly, especially if multiple people are targeting one at the same time. Speaking of bombs from before, they can give Splash Wall users a lot of issues in another way aside from just chucking them for huge damage. Like with Brella shields, bombs will immediately explode upon contact with a Splash Wall, regardless of what their detonation conditions usually are. This means that if you're fighting a Splash Wall user and you catch them stepping ever so slightly in front of their wall so that's no longer between you and them, then a quick toss of a bomb at that Splash Wall will make short work of them. 800 HP as the default health for Splash Walls is already a lot, but perhaps the previous points have you wishing for more. If you haven't guessed it by now, the reason I have to specify that as the default amount is because of sub power-ups effects on Splash Walls. Sub power-up will increase the health that Splash Walls have, and by no small amount either. With a full build of sub power, Splash Walls nearly double in health, going all the way to 1,500. For context, the Rainmaker shield pops when it receives 1,000 damage, so to be 1.5 times that is downright comical. Obviously, no one should run around with that much sub power seriously, but even using one main slot of sub power brings its health over 1000. That sounds really good in theory, but at least in my opinion, sub power up is rarely worth using on Splash Walls, and the reason for that is in the natural health decay. Remember how I said before that Splash Walls lose 15% of their max health every second? That's a percentage, so it does not matter what the max health of the wall actually is, it will still naturally break after the same amount of time. Additionally, the higher you make the wall's health, the more HP it'll effectively uncontrollably lose as time goes by, as that same 15% is now a fraction of a larger number. This means sub power on Splash Walls really only makes a difference immediately after deploying one, before the decay really gets to do much. But in my opinion, default Splash Walls are already tanky enough to rely on them withstanding at least a second or two of fire under most normal circumstances. To wrap up the mechanics talk, I want to take a step back to talk a bit more about the process of actually deploying a Splash Wall. You may have noticed that the way Splash Wall is deployed isn't quite like any other subs we've covered up until now. It isn't thrown like a bomb, nor placed at your feet like a beacon, but rather sort of glides out in front of you briefly before landing on the ground. Getting the hang of deploying Splash Walls can take some getting used to due to this strange travel path, paired with the lack of a visual indicator for the path like most throwable subs have. It's also worth noting that what your character is doing influences the range that walls travel. While jumping, for example, the extra height causes walls to fly a fair bit further than if you're standing still. Additionally, and quite strangely, the vertical alignment of your camera also influences it slightly, with looking down giving the greatest range. This isn't too big of a deal, but it is nice to know. It'll be relevant for a trick we'll cover later on. Another crucial component of deploying a Splash Wall is understanding its startup time, as this is the sub's main built-in weakness. By this again, I mean the time it takes between pressing the sub button and the Splash Wall being active. The startup time of Splash Wall is divided into two parts, those being the time from being thrown to attaching to the ground, and then the time from that to the shield being generated. Walls are set to take a minimum of 25 frames to settle on the ground after being thrown, or just a little less than half a second. This might seem strange, but the reason for this is that the time it takes for a wall to go from your hand to the ground is highly variable depending on the terrain you're standing on. If you throw it off of a ledge, it'll take a long time to fall down the extra distance to the ground below. The opposite is true if you're throwing it up to higher ground, such as up a ramp, as the Splash Wall will make contact with the ground nearly immediately. To prevent Splash Wall from activating instantly in these instances, this minimum required startup time is slapped onto it. You can tell if a Splash Wall is hitting the ground too soon and being forced to wait longer by it visibly shaking for a brief moment before fully extending. After settling down, walls are forced to wait another half of a second before generating the shield and being fully activated. With these times combined, even the most optimal Splash Walls will have to wait nearly a full second of time between deployment and activation that you must wait through before being protected by them. This window of vulnerability is something Splash Wall users must be conscious of to avoid putting themselves in danger by expecting to have cover sooner than it's actually there. That is quite the exhaustive list of all the stats and mechanics we should be aware of when it comes to Splash Walls. As always, now is the part where we find how to best make use of all that knowledge in actual gameplay. As stated before, Splash Wall largely evolves around the concept of mitigating the risk of taking positions and engagements that normally would not be safe, allowing wall users to exert presence more freely than the average weapon can. This is why Splash Wall is commonly given to main weapons that excel at fighting. While the wall itself doesn't do much to threaten opponents, the fact that a strong weapon is free to stand on the other side of it and confidently take whatever fights they please is terrifying and more than makes up for that. Even if you're not actively looking to fight, the flexibility and positioning that wall provides can also enable you to paint and take space more assertively, or even just let you reposition or retreat without fear of getting caught on your way out. Aside from having to manage your ink tank, there isn't often a reason not to have a Splash Wall out anytime you choose to commit to a decision, as that extra safety can only serve to benefit you. This is where the guide will take a bit of a turn compared to most utility guides so far. The purpose of wall in the vast majority of cases will be to protect you while you're doing something. Whatever that something is can vary, but the purpose that wall plays in that remains largely the same. So instead of exploring a variety of use cases for the sub like we normally do, I instead want to give some guidance on tricks and best practices with wall to maximize their impact and make your play around them as consistent as it can be. In order for splash walls to do their job properly, you have to ensure that the wall stays between you and whatever opponent or potential threats it is that you want to stay protected from. This not only means keeping yourself from overstepping the wall, but also preventing the opponent from finding the way around the wall and pushing past it. And what better way to prevent that second option than by placing splash walls in spots where it isn't even possible to get around it. Walls will naturally do best in choke points and narrow corridors where the wall covers most of, if not the entire width of the space, since the terrain itself will block anyone from being able to slip around the sides. However, these spaces can be pretty hard to come by, so that only works so often. A good compromise can be set up a lot more often though. Placing a splash wall so that the edge of the wall aligns with a natural terrain boundary can still help a lot, as this only leaves one side open for enemies to swing around rather than both sides if it was completely in the open. This still simplifies playing around walls significantly, as it's much easier to keep an eye on just one potential approach option than two simultaneously. If you set this up on a corner, this also makes it so the side of the splash wall touching terrain can double as a protected retreat option if you feel a need to reposition, as there'll be no gaps between the splash wall and natural cover from the stage that opponents can try to shoot through. As an extension of this idea, in desperate situations, if you need some immediate cover, you can throw a wall against a corner of the terrain and tuck yourself into the protected cubby it creates. The reason why I say this should only be for desperate situations is because the setup for it can leave you exposed while you wait for the wall to initiate. It also doesn't leave you with any direct way out of that situation once you commit to it. However, that little pocket of safe space you make for yourself can give you a moment to turn around and attempt to reverse the fight on anyone who is chasing you, or at the very least ensure you have the time to super jump back to spawn or a teammate to escape and keep yourself alive. A trick to keep in mind for maximizing the cover splash wall provides, even when it's out in the open, is how the distance between you and your splash wall affects how much it covers you from. In general, the closer you are to your wall, the wider of an angle it'll protect you from. You can easily visualize this by firing at the edges of your splash wall to paint lines on the ground while standing at different distances away from it, and the difference can be quite astounding. So unless you're fighting a weapon like a blaster that can damage you even behind your wall, then don't be afraid to get up real close to it, as that wider angle of protection can swing even more situations in your favor. Some people may already naturally have this habit, since standing closer to your wall also means you get to use more of your weapon's range beyond the wall's position, so it's just another reason to make that a habit. Interestingly, some splash wall weapons have great synergy with their main weapons, let them make the most of this concept. Both the Gluga Dualies and Charcoal Decapitator are known for their movement gimmicks, and both of their unique movement methods just so happen to cover the perfect distance to combo with splash walls being thrown out, at least on flat ground. Gluga is easily the simpler one, with the splash wall thrown while standing on the ground always traveling just barely farther than the distance one roll covers. This means that throwing a splash wall and then rolling forward immediately after sets you up so that as soon as the splash wall activates, you're in the perfect position to make the most of it and threaten quick yet safe kills while stuck in the turret stance. Charcoal Decapitator can do the same thing with its charge dash, but since it covers some extra distance, you have to jump and aim down while throwing the wall if you want to try this. Otherwise, you'll dash forward past your wall and be stuck in the open afterward. Though these setups are situational, they can be a surprise that can earn you some quick free kills if your opponents aren't expecting it, and are a neat trick to know about if you are a fan of one of these weapons. We've talked plenty about the positioning of splash walls, but the timing at which you use them is just as important. As we covered in the mechanics section, walls' greatest inherent weakness is the long startup time it takes before it's active. The implications of this is that walls need to be deployed a bit ahead of time for when you actually intend to leverage them. If you try to spike one down when you're already in a fight, then more often than not it'll already be too late, you'll be finished off before the wall completes its initiation. Instead, walls should be used right before you intend to swing out with them, so that they are active by the time you're actually positioned behind it. To best make use of this, it's ideal to throw the wall from a position that is safe so that you aren't afraid of being challenged while waiting for the wall's initiation, and there's a variety of ways to achieve this. One common way is to use jumping paired with looking down when throwing your splash wall to maximize how far it travels, which in effect allows you to stand further away from the potential dangers you wish to contest with the wall's protection once it's ready. Another common trick is bouncing splash walls off of nearby terrain that you're using as cover already. This allows you to stay in your current position while priming a wall that lets you swing out safely. Additionally, because you're looking into the terrain while throwing the wall, then the orientation of the wall still lines up so that it's facing the correct direction to protect you properly from whatever it is you plan on contesting, since splash walls will always align perpendicularly to the direction you're facing when you throw them. As you can see, there is a lot of depth you can get into when trying to optimize splash walls, and I hope at least one of these tricks was something you didn't know or consider before. With all of those said, while optimization is the main focus of this guide, it wouldn't be an episode of this series if we didn't talk at least a little bit about some of the more niche and creative ways of using this sub weapon. Believe it or not, even a sub this simple still has some wild tricks up its sleeve, so let's explore a few of those. First of all, I couldn't possibly make a video on Splash Ball without talking about the ledge trick. It's something I like so much I've made multiple videos on this channel about it already in the past, so I'll keep it rather brief. Remember early on when I said that knowing about how your camera angle affects the range at which you throw splash rolls will be relevant for a trick we'd talk about? Well, this is that time. For those who don't know about it, if you are positioned underneath one of these standard height ledges as I like to call them, then if you jump and look down and release a splash wall at the peak of your jump, then all of that combined will be enough to just barely get your wall at the height of the ledge, and you can actually place the wall on top of it. This trick looks very goofy, and it has some practicality too. High ground areas are common places for players to position themselves, so being able to temporarily block anyone standing near a ledge from influencing that area that they're overlooking with paint and damage can be useful. And since you deploy the wall from out of sight under the cover of the ledge itself, you'll often be pretty safe while setting this up. It does require you to go pretty far out of your way though, so it's not something that is relevant too often. However, where I find this trick to be the most useful is when climbing up a paintable wall to a new area where enemies are located. In these cases, since you can actually swim up the ledge, positioning a wall above it before you make your way up can protect your approach and give you a shield to play around once you're up there should any opponents try to engage you. Mako Mart has several areas where this is possible to do. It can also be helpful on tower control as that mode frequently adds paintable blocks to stages that open up new flank routes where this can be applied. If you want to see more on this trick, you can check out my YouTube short on it as well as Dude's recent wall video where he covers it in depth, but I knew I couldn't live without at least mentioning this trick here. Another trick with splash walls is using them to block other moving objects. The one that people are likely more familiar with is using walls to break Tenebrella shields. Shield-like objects tend to have very high damage multipliers against each other, and the splash wall versus tent shield interaction is no exception to this. Both objects deal extremely high damage to each other, so upon contact they'll usually destroy each other immediately. This is one of the fastest and most reliable ways in the game to shred Tenebrellas, and it makes any splash wall weapon a real thorn in the side of Tenebrella players everywhere. And of course, if it's enough to break tent shields, then Splatbrella and Recyclebrella shields really stand no chance against splash walls either. What a lot fewer people seem to know about is that this also works with reef sliders. Well, at least kind of. Reef slider is not a breakable object in the way Brella shields are, but they can still be halted in their tracks. If a reef slider runs into a splash wall, it'll get stuck against the wall until the wall breaks, greatly reducing the distance it can travel overall. Where this is by far the most useful is in splat zones, where reef slider desperately wants to get as deep into the zone as possible. If you can predict where a reef slider is coming from that is aimed at the zone to recap it, you can slap down a splash wall in time, you can stop them from reaching the center of the zone and prevent the instant zone flip that they rely on. For how popular splash wall weapons could be on splat zones, I'm honestly surprised I don't see this trick used more often, so I figure a lot of people just don't know about it. And finally, as small of a trick as it may be, I feel like I must continue the legacy that I've started with some of our previous subs. Splash Roll is yet another utility sub capable of interacting with stage objects, dealing continuous damage to them if they are in contact. However, this damage is so small that it can't do a whole lot. An entire splash wall is not enough to inflate most sponges, for example. What it can do though is maintain the elevating fans on Marlin Airport, keeping those platforms in their most extended positions for several seconds all on its own. This is just some neat trivia more than anything, but it can have its moments on that stage, especially for longer range weapons, like Snipe Rider 5B, Z+F Charger, and Custom Explosion, since those weapons appreciate that access to the highly elevated position, but also can't afford to repeatedly fire at the fan directly with their main weapons to actually keep it there. And that does it for all the splash roll knowledge I have to share. That also does it for this series. Utility sub-weapons are so diverse and creative in their design, and it makes them some of my favorite parts of the Splatoon series. It's been fantastic to get to nerd about each of them in such detail, and it makes it even happier that so many of you have enjoyed that too. I really want to thank you guys for the support that this series has gotten. While these videos are fun to make and something I do genuinely care about, they also take a lot of work, especially if you're someone who does every step of the video creation process alone. So it makes it all worthwhile to hear how people appreciate what I have to show for it. Ever since this series has started, I've been getting some requests to cover other subs that don't fall fully under the utility label, such as curling bombs, and I've been considering if I want to continue on and give those their own episodes too. But to stay true to the original goal of this series, to do every sub that's not a bomb, I think this is where the series ends. That's not to say I might not still cover some other subs in their own video though. If I do, it just won't be the exact same format as this. So if you do want to hear my takes and explanations on some other subs, let me know what you'd like to see. Also, I do apologize for this video coming out a bit later than I would have hoped it to. College classes have been demanding, and beyond that I've also been dealing with an unfortunate chain combo of illnesses for several weeks straight now. I'm doing fine, don't worry about me, but I'm still not 100% at the time recording this, and some of you may be able to tell that by my voice being a little off from what it normally is. I'm just happy to be back to work on a video though. I do have several ideas for upcoming projects whenever I do manage to find the time for them. Anyway, that's enough rambling from me. As always, thanks for watching and have a good one.